Morning. It is a pleasure to be here this morning. I always count it a privileged space when I'm invited into the pulpit, in the sense that this is a sacred space, and just have the chance to share how faith interacts with reality in my life and in a passage, and trust that God has that planned for folks here as well. I am here with my family, so we're seated in the back row. Last night I learned we're seated in the back row like good Presbyterians that sit in the back row, and we were looking for a seat at the Y-Dale, and then they pushed us up front. I later learned that the reason why folks sit in the back row is because when it comes time to queue up for the buffet, they start in the back corners. And so, yeah, I learned something last night. But my wife, Danae, my son, Aiden, and oldest son, Caleb. I've been to Southland a couple times, and I share with folks, I love coming down here. Where we came from in the U.S., very much like life here. There's just a real down-to-earth sense to how people see the world and what they do. There's a real practical sense in life. We came from a more rural place in the U.S., and so anytime that I fly in and I spend time here, it's always a challenge to leave. But this is the first time that we've been able to come all together as a family. So it's been a privilege to be here with my wife and boys. We came to New Zealand 7 years ago. Thought that would stay for a year or two, and then in that time, it's been 7 years now, and I find myself leading SIM. I'd just like to bring greetings from SIM as well, and thank you for the prayer and the support for Andrew and Kate and their family, and what they are doing. One of the exciting things that some of you may know, but there's a lot behind it, is that they recently had their visa approved in the 11th hour, and are able to stay longer and pursue the call that God's put on their life. What you may not know is from the place that I sit in SIM, we see that across the world being a potential barrier for people being able to pursue a call that they have. And more, just the very ability to get a visa is the gatekeeper, in a sense, of what can keep someone from pursuing a call that God's put in their lives or not. We have Marie Scully that you may know. She's from Invercargill Way, and she is applying for her visa right now to go back to India. She's had a number of colleagues that were either declined visas to go back into India, some that were given visas, and then when they arrive in India, they're told, no, we don't recognize this, and they're put on a plane and sent home. So if you would, we can praise God for what he's done with the yours, but continue to pray for folks like Marie, that their visa would just have God's hand on it. We recently had one of our missionaries in Lebanon, Steph. She messaged me and she said, please pray. I've just found out that Lebanon's asked me to leave, and she's been in Lebanon and Syria for 18 years and just has an amazing ministry there. And so we just did that. If you're on our prayer network, you would have seen a prayer that went through last week that said, please pray for Stephanie, that decision would be changed. And I received a WhatsApp message from her the next day with just a bounce in her step that she had just received a call from her attorney that said, please come in my office at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning to pick up your residency visa. She had a student tell her that he noticed that her application had shifted from the rejected pile to the accepted pile, and was later talking to her sister, who gets together with a friend and prays for her on a regular basis, and shared that story. And her sister was just astounded, because she said, when we got together and we specifically prayed that God would shift piles for your application. And so they saw that happen. So just from SIM, if you could join us in that. This morning, the passage that I wanted to talk about, it's a call narrative. And I love call narratives in Scripture. One of my favorite verses is out of Job. It's Job 42:5. And it's a space where Job feels like God at least deserves to give him an explanation for what he's put him through. And chapters 38 to 41 is really God putting Job in his place and saying, wait a minute, I'm God. You are not God. You really don't deserve what you think you deserve. And Job's response is one where he says, before I had heard of you, but now I've seen you. Job's been able to interact and see God, and it's had this transformative power. And in the call narratives that we see all through Scripture, we see that. We see where God steps out of his space in heaven and chooses to come down to us and interact with us in a very tangible and real way. And so I love those passages. And when I speak, I love to talk about them. I like, Isaiah and when God speaks to Isaiah. Last night we heard Andrew Campbell share about God speaking to Jonah and what took place there. Or looking to the New Testament and Jesus calling out his disciples, him recommissioning Peter, him having this spectacular experience with Paul on the road and calling him into ministry. So I am inspired when I look at these call narratives. But the one that we're looking at this morning is Moses. And we're actually going to look at quite a bit more than what we read this morning, but I figured if we read the whole passage that we were going to look at, I wouldn't have any time to preach. So we just read the first portion. And this is where God steps into Moses' world and speaks to where he is at and gets his attention. Have you ever had moments like that? Moments that you're just going about your day, where you get up in the morning, you're going through the same routine, whether it's making porridge or whatnot, you're out the door, you're off to work, off to school, you have the appointments that you have in front of you. This is a day like every single other day. And yet, similar to what we see in the passage that we read at the beginning of Exodus, like Moses going through and just tending sheep like he had day in and day out, suddenly there's something different. Sometimes when God speaks to us, it's like we see here in Exodus, where it's a curiosity that draws us to it. It's, I wonder what is going on over there. Moses sees this burning bush, and he's drawn to it to see what was going on. And suddenly the bush starts speaking to him. Okay? Sometimes it's just that thought in the shower moment, that you're sitting in the shower, and you just really have this sense that God wants you to step out and do something that's different from every other day. And you can't walk away from that sense that God is trying to engage. He's inviting you in to a conversation with him at that moment. We had a situation like that in 2004. And really the backstory of this, it started in 1998. In 1998, I found myself, I was a youth pastor in the States. I always had a heart for mission and had just gone on my first missions trip. Took 56, 13 and 14-year-olds into Mexico. It should have been my last missions trip. But for whatever it was, there was something that caught me about that. And I didn't want to be a youth pastor that just took our kids to different communities every single year and didn't build relationship. I wanted to do something where we could journey along with folks. And so at that time, I started praying, God, would you give me a heart for a region of the world? A place that would mean more, that would be something that I would want to build a long-term relationship with. And I just let that prayer just kind of sit and percolate. And so in 2004, I'm in the States and I'm leading a camp in the States. We had been doing it for a number of years. I'm going about my day just like any other day. And I get called into a meeting with our district office. And there's this Kiwi pastor in there that I'd never met before. And he had heard what we were doing in the States with our camp. They had just started a new denomination. They had separated from the denomination that we were a part of to hold on to their values and stepped into this space. And they had yet to start any type of youth ministry. And said, would you come over, help train some of our youth leaders with the youth camp that you're doing, be able to pass on what you have so that they're encouraged. They can go ahead and run, and in a couple years, they'll run a camp on their own. I'd like to say that I knew God was speaking to me at that moment, but it was less spiritual than that. It was really more of New Zealand would be a cool place to go. It's pretty far from here. It's a 3-year commitment. Anyone can do a 3-year commitment. I'd love to go and see a new place. We get to go and feed into leaders. Let's go ahead and do that, and so be it. And so in 2004, I hopped on a plane and came here, and with 6 other people. We had a team, and we spent a week just seeing what the church was like in New Zealand, seeing what the culture was like in New Zealand. We had a chance to work just hand in hand with young people in New Zealand, just get a sense of the heart that they had and what was going on, and the vibrancy and the space that they lived in. And at the end of that week, I can remember, almost like I can see it, of walking out to our plane to get on our plane. And I knew that God would have me and my family back here in New Zealand. I fully expected, when I had been praying that prayer, that the region of the world was going to be some country off in a developing space, and I would go from the U.S. I never thought that God would use it to just change our space and to work with folks that were in the developed world, like the States. And so I went back. The challenge of going back, I stepped back. We were just about to leave from the role that we had in Michigan to take on a new role in New Hampshire. Danae was about 7 weeks from having Aiden. We're coming closer to our family, that we really wanted to be closer to our family for ages. I've been married long enough to know that that's not the time you come back from a trip and say to your wife, guess what, we're moving across the world. And so I just sat on that and let it be, and just let it percolate. Now, we fast forward a little bit. I think we think that if we ever had a burning bush moment, if we got up in the morning and walked out in our front yard and saw something like that and had a bush talk to us, it would be very easy for us to follow on and to follow what God was asking us to do. And the reality is, I think Moses' response is a little more complicated than that, or a little more real than that. If you look at the passage, so we read 1 through 4, but I'd like to look specifically at Moses' response to God when God calls him in to join him and to lead the Israelites out of captivity. Moses' first response is, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" That's verse 11. Then verse 13, Moses says to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them?" So first, who am I? Why me? The second, what authority do I go with? How can I trust being called into that space? If we jump into Exodus 4:1, it's a question of security. Moses answered, "What if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you?" Okay, so what if I'm challenged? And then in Exodus 4:10, Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." Now we see Moses starting to make excuses. God, you've obviously picked the wrong person. It can't be me. I don't have the gifting to do this. And then in 13, he gets to the point where he finally says, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." I find that very interesting. Pardon your servant, Lord. So he recognizes he's talking to God, yet has the audacity to say, "Please send someone else, God. You must have gotten it wrong." Now, I grew up thinking, how could Moses react like that? And in 47 years of aging and maturing and just seeing how I react to things, I looked at it and then I say that I actually think Moses' response is normal. I mean, put yourself in Moses' shoes for a second. If you're familiar with Moses' narrative, he grows up in royalty. He has every gift handed to him on a silver spoon. Okay? He has every opportunity put in front of him that he should be able to have. But he stuffs it up. He goes and kills someone and tries to hide it, and his sin is revealed. And he's confronted with the shame of what he's done and runs away into the wilderness and hides and tends sheep. Now, if he's like me, and if you're like me, just because I'm running and hiding and tending sheep doesn't mean that I don't have this conversation going on in my head and this voice that's going on. And I can see Moses getting up every morning, grabbing his staff, going out to his flock. And as he's walking with his flock, he's telling himself how he had it so good, but he screwed it up. He's telling himself how I had every opportunity open to me. But really now, what can I do? I have no opportunities in front of me. And when you tell yourself and you have that conversation over and over and over again for years, it shouldn't surprise us that even when God speaks to us, sometimes it's hard for God to break through that conversation and speak to us. And he puts us in this space that we have this crisis of belief that we have to choose. Are we actually going to put aside that dialogue and that God take us on a new journey? Or are we going to allow ourselves to be captured by that dialogue and step away from what God may want to do? For us in this crisis of belief, the sense of call that we felt in 2004, if we fast forward to 2007, 2007 was the most difficult ministry year and just life year for my family that I can remember. I had just come through a season in a church that was a soul-damaging season and stepped out of that role. In 2006, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, and we went through, Danae went through chemotherapy, she went through radiation treatment. And so at the end of that treatment, we find ourselves in a space saying, God, what is next? What's going on? And we looked at the different opportunities and the different things that we had in front of us. And trying to say, where do you want to have us next? And we were planned people, so we had A priority options, B priority options, and C priority options. And I thought this would be a good time to bring up New Zealand as one of the options. And so that's when we started talking about it. I'm a dreamer. My wife's more anchored than I am. And so I was lucky to get New Zealand on the C priority list. And we continued to explore, to just say, God, what do you want to do? What do you want to have in us? But what we found as we looked at all the opportunities God would put in front of us and put in our way, there was this question in the back of our heads, or at least in the back of my head, that was always saying, but what about New Zealand? But what about New Zealand? I actually had a role that I almost said yes to. And as I drove further away from the role, I felt less and less confident that that's where God wanted us. And I called Danae driving back and I said, hon, I really think God's saying that we need to wrestle with, is he calling us to New Zealand first? And then he'll give us freedom to look at anything else. Now, like I said, my wife's the more anchored one of us. Okay, so this was a crisis of belief for us. And she's a list maker. I'm not a list maker. I woke up the next morning, she had a 38-point list of things we had to work through to be able to determine if we could come here. Now, 36 of those things were really easy to work through. But there were two that were quite significant. One was moving away from family, and the other was health. And just a concern of, if I move to a new location, am I going to get the same treatment, the same level of care that I'll get here? Very, very real things. And as her husband, I couldn't minimize those things. I couldn't put them away. It really, the 38 came down to two that we had to wrestle with. We told this to friends, and we expected our friends to say, you're crazy, you're 38 years old, you're supposed to buy a home and settle down, you don't sell everything and move somewhere else. But our friends kept saying to us, don't you see God in this? Which only increased that sense of that crisis of belief. And so just like Moses, we tried to find some of our excuses, but we kept finding answers to those things, pushing us back and saying we really, really had to consider what was going on. And so we came to a place where we had to choose whether we could trust God with these areas. And I'd like to say that we did it on our own, but the reality was another thing that we see in this passage, in this call narrative, is that God had to use other people as a part of what was going on to let us see what he was doing. If you go ahead and look back, we'll go back to Exodus 3. And if we look at verses 18. In studying this narrative, I've read this narrative heaps since a child. I grew up in a Christian home. But when I was started to prepare this message, this stuck out to me for the first time. And it was something that I had missed every other time that I read before. And so 18, God is talking to Moses, and he says, the elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord. I've always seen this narrative as God just calling Moses, and it was an individual call. It was one-on-one with them. But what the passage here is telling us is, while God does call us as individuals, there's a community sense to what he is doing too, that God involves the people around us, and God calls them in with us. If you jump over to 4, this is the one that we're familiar with, 4:14, when Moses is concerned about his eloquence. He says, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak with you. He is already on his way to meet you, and he'll be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. You know, when God calls us into something, there is that sense of community. There is that sense of involving the people around us. I had one professor in seminary say that our understanding of God is directly related to our understanding of the community that we find ourselves in. If we choose to be very individualistic in how we pursue faith, we have a limited understanding of who God is. But as we start to pursue God as a community, we start to understand a whole nother aspect of what it needs to follow God. And for us, we had a very similar situation like this. For our crisis of belief, the only thing that pushed us through that were the friends and the people that we involved in this journey. So when we were exploring this, we went out to 6 trusted friends to test this with us. And they kept saying to us, don't you see what God is doing here? Okay. With the concerns that we had, the concerns for family, we shared that with a friend of ours who, her dad headed up Youth for Christ Asia Pacific. And when he was wrestling with, did he step into that call, he was concerned about how far away family would be. And they felt that God said to them, listen, I've answered every other concern about this appointment that you've had. Can't you trust me with this one unknown? And it was that revelation that allowed them to step into that role. And when they spoke that to us, it was as if God was speaking to us and saying, okay, you've gone from 38 down to 2. I've answered 36. Can't you trust me with 2? And then it pushed us, but it still didn't get us over the line to where we were willing to trust God with what he was calling us to. And unity was important to me. So I found myself in a space that I wasn't feeling well. We were talking. It was a conversation like every other night when we would talk. We would talk about New Zealand, what God could be calling us to. We could see all the positive things, but we'd come to the 2 things, and we didn't have an answer for them. And so I went to bed. I wasn't feeling well that night. And I went to bed expecting that I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning, and over breakfast, I'm going to sit with Danae and say, you know, kind of a fleece that I had put out to God was that we would be in unity on this decision. We're obviously not there, so God must be calling us to something else. And that's okay. There's no resentment there, but God's just moving in a different way. I had no idea that from the time that I went to bed to the time that I woke up, Danae would be up and the phone would ring. And she would look at the caller ID and see that it was her friend Jill. Jill is that friend that God seems to speak through and talk directly to you. And so when Danae saw that it was Jill and she knew what we were talking about, she actually debated on whether or not she should answer the phone and if she wanted to talk to her. And in that conversation, so much went on. But again, it came back to that space of God speaking through Jill and saying, can't you trust me with what you are doing? Now, I didn't know any of this was going on. I just wake up in the morning and kind of rubbing my eyes, and Danae's in the room, and I'm expecting to start my conversation. And as I wake up, I realize she's emotional, and I'm wondering what's going on. And the first thing she says to me is, we're going to New Zealand. We would have never been here if it wasn't for sharing that call, for involving others in what was going on, for God saying, you know what, I am going to call you and your family to this role in New Zealand, but I'm going to use others as well as part of that. And so that brings us to where we are today. You know, we came to New Zealand 7 years ago. 2 years became 4. 4 years became what's now 7. I started out serving a local church with their community ministry, worked with Tier Fund, and in that space, God developed this call within us for what's happening with the New Zealand church and mission within New Zealand. And then I find myself in a space where I can step into the role that I'm in now with SIM. And being able to work with people that step into this space when God calls them on a regular basis. So people like the Ewers, people like the bars in Gore that are currently stepping into a space in Burkina Faso. If you haven't heard their testimony, it's an amazing testimony. And I would encourage you, they're close by. You can hear them. We have a young woman in Christchurch that has been working with Hagar International with human anti-trafficking. And she felt God was telling her that he wanted her to look at something different and to change and to have more of a global focus. And she resisted. She didn't want to do that. And she certainly didn't want to work for a missions organization where she had to raise her own support. Lo and behold, one week she finally says to God, God, I surrender. If you want to do something with me, you can do something with me. And out of the blue, I had no idea this was going on, but the next week I called her and said, hey, we're looking for someone to fill a role within SIM. It's a job offer that's open. I can't offer you any money. You have to raise your own support. I fully expected her to say no, only to realize that God had us intersecting right at the right moment, and now she's preparing to step into that call. So we see that over and over again. There are some things that I've learned in our journey and as I've engaged with this passage in Scripture. One of them is that God does call each of us to something. To missionaries, he calls over the hill, to people that we can't see, to cultures that we don't know. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't call those of us that stay. He calls us to do something where we're placed. And we have that choice when he calls to step into it or to step away from it, to recognize whether that's God's voice and have the courage to take that step. I had a pastor earlier this year share with me that we don't go into church to stay in the church. We come into this space to springboard out, to be fully Christian, a fully follower of Christ in the places that we find ourselves, in our workplace, in school, wherever that would be. And so how can you step in and represent Jesus Christ where you find yourself? We've also come to see that concerns are going to come up no matter what God calls us to. The call that God puts on us requires faith, that requires that to step out. And so we can choose to see those things, those concerns, as obstacles or as opportunities. We can go ahead and see them as something that in that crisis of faith, we choose not to have the courage to step into it, and we say, no, we can't do that. Or we can see it as an opportunity to see God come and join us, to see how we can trust him with the unknown, and God can speak into that unknown. And we've also come out of this with a much more profound love for community. You know, I look across this room here, and I see a number of eyes looking up at me. There may be some people here that would be called into mission service. God may be doing some of that percolating in their lives, or there may not. But I don't doubt that there's a call on everyone here to do something where you are. I don't doubt that God is putting something that's a bit scary in front of us, that he wants this church to be an influence to this community. And we can choose to walk out that door and hold that on our own. Or if you look around, I'm sure you can see some people that you might think are wise, that you might think are people that can help you process something. What would it look like if you shared that little bit of nudging, what God's doing in your life, with someone else, and you said, hey, help me think through this, help me process this. Maybe be that extra voice of courage to help me actually do it. There'd be a profound impact on this community if we started to develop and go further with the community right here. And then the final bit that I'd leave you with. One of the friends of mine that came to New Zealand with us on the early trip, we continue to encourage each other in ministry. And somewhere along the way, we've gotten used to saying, enjoy the journey. And so we'll go ahead and we'll talk about the challenges, we'll talk about the good things that are going on. But we will finish it with, hey, enjoy the journey. And it's not just a saying to us, it's really a reminder that when we choose to follow Jesus Christ, when we choose to say, God, what do you want to do with my life? That's not a burden. That's not something that we have to do. There's a joy in that. If we believe that God has our best plans in mind, that God can see what it is that we need, we should be able to enjoy that journey, the highs and the lows. We should be able to enjoy stepping into what he's calling us to do. I firmly believe that it's the best journey to be on, even though it can be really challenging. And that's what I'd want to leave you with. As you step in, springboard out, be willing to say yes to God's call. Be willing to see the challenges as opportunities and step into your crisis of faith. Involve the folks around you. And sit back and reflect and enjoy the journey that God has you on. Thank you.